This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not reflect the views of the Village Network. If you are struggling with mental health, please see our show notes for a list of resources.
Welcome to Let's Explore That. I'm Lynette.
I'm Clint.
And we are sorry to say that Matthew is out for today recovering from surgery. He's our other co-host who is usually here making everyone laugh, but
that is true.
Sadly not today. So we brought in a special Village Network friend, Tammy Wargo, to take his place.
Hello. Hello.
Tammy, what's your job at the Village?
I'm the chief HR officer here and just, try to take care of the people so they can take care of the kids.
Tammy is the surefire smiling face that you'll see every day at the Village. It's so great to have her here.
Oh, thank you.
And we're also really grateful that Tammy is here because she brought us an extra special guest today, Katharine Manning, author of The Empathetic Workplace. We've all read her book. We're all obsessed.
It's really good.
It is. It's really good. And I have to ask you first. So has NBC contacted you about like Mariska Hargitay doing a network version of your life?
Oh my God, that would be amazing.
Because
it would. Yes. Wow. I hadn't even thought about that, but I love it. Yeah. And especially her.
She's incredible.
She's amazing. I think she could do you justice. But so we give some context to our listeners. Can you tell us a little bit about your professional history, and then they'll understand why I think Mariska Hargitay should play you?
Sure. Gosh, I'm so honored by that. As you said, my name is Katharine Manning. I'm a lawyer, but as a lawyer, I've mostly worked with victims of crime. So I started off back in college doing hotline work, domestic violence, rape crisis work. It was really that pushed me to go to law school. And then after law school, I ended up at the U.S. Department of Justice, where I spent 15 years as a senior attorney advisor on victims' rights. What that meant is that I would do policy and training and advise in cases on how the department should work with the crime victims. And over the years, I was there for about 15 years. In that time, I started to realize a few things. One was that people didn't need different things based on what they were a victim of. Like, it wasn't like the way that we would support a victim of terrorism was all that different than the way we would treat a victim of human trafficking. Obviously everybody's story is their own and their victimization is unique. But the ways that we needed to support them were surprisingly similar. Like, everybody needed information about what happened and what was going to happen next. Everybody needed a little help to get on their feet again. Everybody needed to feel like they had a voice in what was happening. So I started to realize that. And then the second thing I started to realize was that it wasn't just the victims who needed those things. It was all of us. It was my colleagues. It was my employees. It was me. It turns out that all of us sometimes go through really difficult life circumstances and could use a little help. And those circumstances can be work-related, like you're dealing with some really difficult matter. It could be just life-related. Everybody goes through challenges in their lives sometimes. And I started to realize that these ways that we support each other in those moments, those really hard moments of our lives, have a lasting impact on individual well-being, like our ability to heal, on trust between us, and ultimately on our mission, our ability to do the work that we need to do out in the world. Because if we know that we have each other's backs, we will be able to do so much together. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I do now. I left the Justice Department in 2019. I started working on the book. The book came out in 2021, and since then I've been doing training and consulting all on building trauma-informed workplaces that support each other, their community, their employees, through hard times.
It's so inspiring to me that you worked with people who've gone through some of the most tragic things humans can go through, bombings, school shootings, and that you still were able to come out of that with what is essentially a very hopeful message.
Honestly, it was something that I saw again and again in my work. I would see people who went through things that I think, how on earth could any one person be put through so much? It just seemed so unfair and awful. And yet I would see them. I mean, they were all just these sources of light, this brightness in my life. I would see the ways that they would take horrific circumstances and turn it into a better world for all of us, pass laws and start nonprofit organizations and create these beautiful art installations. And it really was such a source of hope and optimism for me to realize that when we are able to get support, get some help through our hard times, it's just incredible what humans can do.
Wow. That's amazing. When I started reading your book, audiobook, listen, because I don't have time. But it was, I loved the practicality of it. Like I loved so much how you just broke down the ability, like all the little steps to create an empathetic workplace. But I think what I've thought for a while that could be really helpful is just like in general, yeah, the workplace is great, but humans as a whole, society, I think, does Dr. Perry talk about that? How like most of society's problems could be solved if everybody would embody a little bit of empathy. And so I think it's a really important thing, but it is a skill that you have to develop. And so obviously you've gained a lot of the information that you wrote the book on from all of your experience in the justice system and all those types of things. But how did you see the people who experience those things develop that for themselves? Like is it through the healing process? Is it through the grieving process? How do they get from, I've been a part of a tragic situation and now I have this light inside of me, as you kind of described it?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's unique for every person. And that's one of the hardest things about working with people in these times is you want so much to make it better and to make it predictable and to, like I often think about, I did a training once and it was for kind of a general audience, and I walked through, these are the 5 steps to an empathetic response to trauma on the job. And at the end, during the Q&A, this woman raised her hand, and I'm going to talk about sexual violence, but at a very high level, just FYI. A woman raised her hand and she said, I'm the HR person for a small family-owned company, and one of my colleagues came to me to tell me that she had been assaulted by her supervisor, her boss. And, it's a really small company. This was a friend of hers. And she said, I did everything right. I did everything you said. I listened to her. I believed her. I got her support. I, conducted an investigation. We eventually were able to get the guy fired. But despite all the things I did, she just seemed to slip away. She stopped coming into work on time and then stopped coming altogether. And she would call and then she stopped even calling. And it just felt like nothing I could do. I kept offering more kinds of support and it just seemed like nothing helped. And she said, what should I have done differently to fix that? And I thought, oh man, I wish, like I wish I had like the exact right thing to say, or like, here, just take this book and everything's better, and it just doesn't work that way. And it's so hard when you see somebody who is struggling like that and you can't make it better. But what I also know is that who that woman was on that day is not who she was going to be in 6 months or 6 years or 16 years. And if we try to, short circuit it, or we try to like kind of take over and say, here's what you need to do to get better, we're never gonna be right. Their path is theirs to walk, and we can't ever, I think we have to have the humility to know we can't ever know what is the next best step for them. But also they might need to have that difficult time to prepare them for the incredible things that they're going to go on to do later. So it's so hard when you're trying to support somebody and you see them struggling like that. But I do know, and this is something that I've taught myself again and again through trial and error, you really can't fix it for anybody else. All you can do is provide some support, let them know that they're not alone, and then trust that this is the right path for them and they know best.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that really stood out to me because I'm a fixer. And you know, it's like, I think what is in your book is that you can't fix it. You just really have to listen and make sure that you're giving them space to share and then giving them resources to go to and help to empower them to go back to doing what they do and that they can come back and talk. But the one thing that I found is that it really helps to keep those boundaries clear, which I think so many of us worry about that, right? It's like, oh, how do I fix this? Or what do I need to do for this next thing? And so that was a really helpful part of your book for me, as just a person, but then also like in my role. And I think leaders in general, you know, we get that heavy stuff brought to us and then we think, oh, how do I fix this? Or what's the next step? And so, yeah, that was a very helpful part to me. So
Yeah, it's such a common thing. I mean, certainly for somebody as caring as you are, obviously, you know, it's you see somebody in pain and you want to make it better. And I think also it's just a natural thing as we get more senior in our jobs because the way we get more senior is by being really good at fixing things. You know, somebody comes to you with a problem and you can very quickly, you know, resolve it or reframe it. That's awesome. That's, you know, what everybody wants in the workplace. And that is really, really helpful in probably 90% of your job. But in this one area, it's important to take a step back and really think about what does this person need right now and try to offer them what they need, but not imposing your own solutions.
So would you say that's probably the most integral part of creating not just an empathetic workplace, and I haven't thought about that I'm going to get to, but just like as starting to like practice empathy as a person is the key, the whole key is just being able to listen and support without having to come in with like, and I guess, how did you arrive at that? Like, because I don't think a lot of people arrive there. They're like, I'm a good problem solver. Like Tammy says, which is not a bad quality, but problem solving is not always what is needed to help somebody heal emotionally and mentally. So like, what were the common threads that you saw in all of your experience that kind of led you to like, oh, this is what would help develop that skill?
Yeah, it's such a great question. You know, I was so fortunate in my time in the Justice Department to work with some really amazing victim advocates. And for them, it was so intuitive that they couldn't even really tell you what they were doing, but I would study them. You know, how is it that you are doing this? And how do you have the bravery to sit with this person who has, you know, just gone through unimaginable tragedy and just hold that space and not try to tell them, well, you know, everything happens for a reason, you know, not try to talk them out of how they're feeling, not try to solve it, but just be willing to sit there with them. And I saw how powerful that was, and that you would see the relief on the person, that this isn't somebody who's going to tell me, you know, one of those platitudes, but is actually just going to like be willing to be with me right here in the really like awful muck that I'm sitting in, but at least I won't be alone for a little bit. I could see the impact on them and also recognize that was work. I think we often think of listening as very passive, like you're just sitting there quietly, you know, but it's actually the presence in that moment is actually quite a lot of work and concentration.
Well, I feel like what you're almost saying is like, you have to choose to an extent to be emotionless, right? Like it's so easy for our like internal response to be emotional and like, well, this is what you need. This is what will make me feel good. And you have to almost control that and say, this is not my time to have emotion. And I feel like that's with mental health in general, right? Like therapists, you don't go to a therapist to have them commiserate with you about their problems and how it relates to yours. Like you just really want them to listen to you and help you work through it without inserting themselves in there. I don't know. I don't know.
It's hard. And, you know, I think in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. Like, I worry sometimes people go into almost robot mode, like they just shut down entirely. And the other person will realize that. It will not
I am
be.
here for you.
Yes, exactly. That sounds really difficult. You know?
Yeah.
So it's like we still need our humanity.
Right.
But you're right.
Balancing that.
Yeah, it's balancing that. And so one of the things I talk about in the book and in my trainings is like having a few tools in your back pocket to help you navigate your emotional response. Because again, it's not a bad thing to be human and have a human response, but you don't want it to like pull focus, right? So a couple of them are just like a good, easy breathing technique. Honestly, the breathing is just aim for a longer exhale than an inhale, like roughly twice as long. It is really common when you're interacting with somebody in trauma or distress that you start to get like a little antsy, like that's that like fight, flight, freeze sort of response. So it gives you a surge of adrenaline. So one of the things I do is I clench my fist and release it under the desk, or I flex my calves. So it's sort of an invisible way of releasing some of that energy. And I find that can be really helpful too. But it's important to find a healthy way to navigate that, because it's also, in addition to going into robot mode and the person will recognize it, it's also not good for you to just be like squashing your feelings down, you know? And also to be clear, like what we're talking about is workplace conversations with a colleague. So it is a little different than therapy. And certainly they're going a lot deeper into like therapeutic treatment. You know, they're trying to get to the healing. I really think of this as almost like the CPR or like EMT. Like you're the one on the scene, you see that there's a problem, you give them some immediate support, and then you send them off to the experts.
Sure. That makes sense. But the question that I alluded to earlier that I had a thought about is, was there intentionality in writing it for the workplace? Because my thought is that's actually extremely smart, a smart way to get to more people. Because if you just wrote it as like how to be an empathetic person, everybody's going to walk by that on the shelf, because it's like, well, I want to work on myself for me, not for how I can help others, because we are inherently selfish. But yeah, that's just like, it's interesting to me that you chose to go the workplace route, because, and my second prong of that question is going to be for Tammy on like, when you read the book or discovered it, how did you feel, especially because you run an organization or work in an organization that has a lot of people in it, that it was going to be an applicable way you could transform the way the organization works, but also that inevitably changes the people that are there. So first you.
So, I mean, certainly I was not thoughtful enough to think, oh, this is probably going to sell better at all. That was definitely not like, but I was coming off of all this time advising people in a workplace about how to have these conversations. So it was very much kind of where my head was. It was where my experience was. I thought there are probably other people out there, you know, doing a much better job on just kind of human interactions in general, or marital or parent-child or any of that. But I thought, you know, I've seen quite a lot of these workplace conversations, and I feel like I have some expertise with that. But with that said, I mean, I've certainly heard quite a lot people saying like, man, this is really going to help me with my wife, or, you know, with my kid. And I've had people, one of my favorite interactions in a training, we were working on listen and just acknowledge, don't problem solve. And there was a break, and this woman came running back from the break, and she said, my daughter called while I was on break. And she started telling me about this interaction she had with a professor and how upset she was. And my impulse was, well, what you need to do is, and she said, but I stopped and I said, that sounds really hard, honey. And her daughter said, thank you, Mom. It is really hard. She felt like a rock star, you know? So I think it does help in other environments, but it was really inspired by my work in the workplace. And more specifically, the reason that I ever thought, like, just take this from something that I am doing at the Justice Department to thinking about it more broadly was because of Me Too. When Me Too happened in 2018, and I started to realize that these issues had a much broader application and really were happening all over the world. And in part, I was also motivated by some frustration around Me Too. Like, I felt like Me Too was putting so much on survivors. Share your story. Everybody needs to hear your story. I was getting text messages from friends like, do I have to put my story out on Twitter? I've never spoken to anybody about it, but if I don't say it publicly, am I letting down the side or something, And I was like, no, it is not your responsibility to share your story with anybody. But it seemed like there was so much pressure on survivors to share their story without an understanding that when somebody shares their story of trauma or distress with you, you have an obligation, you have a responsibility to listen and provide support and compassion. And I knew, because of all the work at DOJ, I knew you could do that while still conducting a full and fair investigation and, accomplishing all of your other missions in the workplace. So that's really where I started thinking about, well, what would you say people should do? And that's what led to the book.
Interesting.
And so for me, I think it started, we have trauma-informed care that we utilize, our therapists utilize in the work with their clients. And so several things were going on in my mind. I was sort of like, okay, well, how do we do? It seems to work so well for our kids. Why wouldn't we want to try to do this for each other? Trauma-informed care for the workforce. And so that led me down some research, to looking at some research, and just, I don't find very much research on trauma-informed care for the workforce. And I was also thinking, about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that, it became so political, and I was just sort of like, gosh, this is not what I want. This is not what I'm thinking. I don't want to be political in what we're trying to do. I really just wanted to do something that would really help take care of the employees. And so then I started thinking, I just want people to feel like they can really have a sense of belonging in this organization and a sense of inclusion. And so as I was doing more research, I came across Katharine's workshop that she actually had, a 1-hour just online workshop. And I logged on and I listened to it, and I'm like, yes, this is what I'm looking for. And then got her book, and I just got really excited. I think I reached out to you as soon as I listened to it. And because that was what it was about. It was about just really, how do we have conversations that are caring and supportive, and help people that no matter what background you come from, first of all, we all know that we've had some sort of traumatic experiences in our life, and that those, along with a lot of other experiences, form who we are. So if we really want to bring our whole selves to work, we're bringing all of that past with us. And sometimes that affects us whenever we're in the workplace. And so just be able to have those conversations. So that's how I kind of came across her book, and why I really thought we need to do this, and we need to train supervisors on how to have these conversations with their staff, and to really help with that sense of belonging and inclusion.
I love that phrase you just used, bringing your whole self to work, because I think that I kind of came up in the professional force, and I'd be curious to know if you guys had the same experience with this idea that you compartmentalize when you go to work. Like you shut off those other parts of your brain that might have feelings so that you can do your job. And in what ways do you think that, this is maybe a question for both of you, that might be harmful for workplaces?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Katharine has thoughts on that, but I think that's one of the things I like about this book, and the way that she talks about the laser method, and because we can shut people down, and that can be very harmful. But also, I recognize the fact that we have to have some boundaries, that if we're going to enter into having those conversations, we also have to know where those boundaries are. And this is a workplace, and so work does need to happen, right? So it's not like it can be a license for people to just no longer have to do what's expected of them. But there is a way for us to be compassionate and caring and still set those boundaries. So I think it'd be harmful if we're just shutting people down. I was kind of raised like that, right? Like, hey, listen, put that over there, because that doesn't matter here. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of times it does, because it affects who we are and who we become. So, yeah, I don't know. Katharine, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. And it makes me think of a particular interaction I had, a quick story. I was talking once with a CEO of a company, and I was telling him a little bit about who I am and what I do, and he got kind of quiet. And then he said, after a minute, he goes, we almost fired one of my best friends. And what he told me was that this other guy was their head of sales for the company, and they had sort of come up together and, had known each other for a very long time. And this head of sales was a really, really important part of the company. He was sort of a pillar of why it was so successful. And then one day his performance just fell off a cliff. Like, he was distracted, he was showing up late, he was not responsive. And the rest of the leadership team had a meeting about him, and they concluded that they were going to have to fire him, because they said, we can't have somebody in this role who is not able to perform. This is too important a job. And then finally somebody said, well, why don't we just talk to him first? And when they did, they discovered that his wife was dying. And he hadn't wanted to say anything because he thought, this is my home stuff and I shouldn't be bringing it into the workplace. But once he was able to open up, first of all, he met with a really kind response, compassion. They felt terrible. They immediately got some supports around him to help him go through that. But according to the CEO, he said this guy's performance did a 180 that day, like before the supports were even in place. And the way I think about it is, like, you have the stress of whatever the person is going through, and there's not much you can usually do about that. And then you have the added stress of the work, and there's some you can do about that, but the work has to get done. But then there's this third stress, which is, what is work going to say about what I'm going through? And all of that effort to hide that and to pretend everything is okay, that is actually an additional burden on you. And if we can release that, then we can let you focus on the first two, which are so much more important, and allow you to really focus in the ways that you need to show up in those moments. And I think when we can do that, I think about just issues like turnover, right? And loyalty and productivity and all that. They stood by this guy when his wife was dying. He's never going to leave. He's always going to feel this connection to this company because of the ways that they showed up for him in that really difficult moment. So that's why I feel like this work is so important. It's important for the individual. It's important for our relationships. It's really important for our organization as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like too, what you're kind of saying is that we need to treat, or the goal is that we build the company into community versus just a structure where we come and do a job and leave, because that ultimately builds, like you just said, it builds all the things that everybody wants. Everybody wants all of they want loyalty, they want performance, they want dedicate, they want all that stuff. But if you're just coming in and it's all this transactional, I'm going to do this, and I'm not nobody's going to know anything about me. Eventually, once there's a better offer or a better place where I can get more or do what I want, you're going to leave. But if you build community instead, and I think that's the key to what your book says, and what we've heard many, many times, is just that you can build better communities if you all have empathy. Mm-hmm. I'm a huge believer. It's something that needs to change, especially today in the U.S. Mm-hmm. There's no way right now that I think that's going to happen. Sorry to be cynical.
Well, I think one shared experience that Clint and I have had over the last few years is we both have young kids at home. So we have both had to learn how to be professionals while being parents, which I think for many people for a long time, that was one of those things that was meant to stay at home, right? You didn't talk about your kids at work. If your kids were sick and you had to take a day off, that's just too bad. And I think, actually, I'll give the Village a big shout out for this. One of the great things about starting to work here is I asked, if my kid is sick, can I work from home? Is that okay? And they said, of course, of course that's fine. But that's not the case for so many workplaces, but it's something that so many people deal with. So I think having those conversations and being able to acknowledge that we all have lives and things that are maybe a bit outside of our control is so important. But I'm sorry, you were starting to say something.
Gosh, what was I going to say? I don't remember now.
Oh, that's okay. Well, we've mentioned the laser method a few times here. Could you dive into that, Katharine? Tell us what that is and why it works.
Sure, absolutely. So, as I said, this really kind of grew out of me too, and seeing that so many people were having these conversations about traumatic experiences, but without really knowing how you're supposed to respond when somebody tells you something really heavy that's weighing on them. And again, really a big reliance on what I saw from the victim advocates. And I ultimately realized that I thought there were 5 things that we should do. And the first is listen. Active listening, which means not just sitting there mutely, but, creating the circumstances where people feel comfortable opening up, giving them your full attention, showing interest in what they're saying, allowing them to go on. But then the second one is acknowledge. And acknowledge is a step I think is often missed. And when it seems like a conversation is kind of going poorly, it's usually the person needs more acknowledgement. It's just letting the person know you heard them. You know you heard them, right? But they don't really know until you let them know. And what can happen is all the way through as they're talking, we're doing our great active listening techniques, but in our head we're thinking, oh, I know exactly what this person needs to do. I know where to send them. This is going to be so great. I'm going to tell them exactly what they need. And maybe you do have really phenomenal information, but before they can hear you, they have to know that you heard them. So it's just a quick statement that's along the lines of, thank you for sharing that, or thank you for letting me know, or it sounds really hard. I'm sorry you're going through all that. Just something that lets them know you heard them. What you want to avoid are responses that either deny or distract from what they've said. Denial is like, I'm sure it's all going to work out just fine, or you probably didn't mean it that way. Distraction is something like, my friend went through something similar and she's just fine. Let me tell you all about her now. And then suddenly we're having this conversation about my friend, right? So it's something that just acknowledges where they are. The next step is share information with them. This is something I saw again and again in my work with victims. Everybody craved information. It was almost insatiable, this desire for more information. And I began to realize that when we're going through a period of our lives where it feels like everything is turned upside down, it's really uncomfortable. And part of what is uncomfortable is the loss of control. Like I was, just driving home from work like normal, and suddenly I'm in a car accident and I spend the next 6 weeks in the hospital, and I didn't do anything wrong. And it's really, really hard to kind of wrap your head around that sense that sometimes horrible things happen and we didn't have any control over it. Well, as they say, knowledge is power. So when you can share information with people, you help them regain a sense of control in a time that feels really out of control. So the information that you're sharing is information that is helpful to them. It's like any factual information, if you have that, is useful, like about what happened. But even if you don't have that, you can share things like process information. This is how complaints are filed, or this is how decisions are going to be made on this. You can share values information, either your personal values or your organization's values. So I take these issues very seriously, or we take these issues very seriously. And then finally, even being upfront about what you don't know can be helpful. Like, I actually don't know how complaints are filed, but let me see if I can find it out. It shows that you're not hiding the ball and that you will continue to be a source of reliable information. So that's step 3, share. And then step 4 is empower. And I think of this as really being as important for us as the listeners as it is for the person in trauma, because so many of us are fixers and we really want to make it better. This is to remind you that they have their own path to walk and you can't walk it for them. But you can give them a few tools maybe to help them along the way. So empowering them with resources. resources, mental health resources, flexible work options, maybe security resources. I hope, and these can both be in your workplace as well as in the community. So I hope everybody knows about 988, our National Mental Health Crisis Line, available English, Spanish, phone or text 24 hours a day, perfectly free. And then in addition, another great resource is 211, which connects you with local resources in your community. So maybe the person needs help with something you don't know anything about, like elder care or addiction support. If you give them 211, they can get some help locally for them. The thing is really to remember that this is about what they need. So a great place to start is, what do you need right now? Or how can I help? And then listen and try to get them to the services that are actually useful for them. And then the final step is return, which is both, it's kind of twofold. So it's both returning to the person, literally, like to check in on them later and see how they're doing, show that you continue to be a source of support. But also really important, it's a return to ourselves. Like, supporting others takes a toll on us, and we have to be taking care of ourselves so that we can continue to thrive in all the ways that we need and want to in our lives too.
It's great. I mean, I think of how I've seen that play out a couple times, even just recently. One of them being with the flooding in North Carolina, and just thinking about the individuals there. And, you know, you go from, I had my house and everything one day, and now I have literally, like, my entire community is gone, and wondering what's going to happen next, and when am I going to be able to rebuild a house, or when am I going to have running water again? And I think that some of those things are interesting, especially in the context of the United States, because not having running water in a large municipality like Asheville is something that is like not a normal thing. Like, I can walk into most any building and turn on a faucet and get water. And now, like, that's completely foreign, but when am I going to get that? And thinking of how some of the responses have been of, this is like when we're planning, and this, like, just the municipality communicating and the state communicating back, kind of applying some of the principles that you're talking about. And then also just like, we have some friends who just experienced some loss, and just knowing how to work and interact in that situation. Having like lost somebody myself in my life, like, I know that if I was in that situation when I was, like, I don't want to hear about what it's gonna be like, or all those things. And so the text messages that go out are just, I see you, I know it's hard. If you need anything, please let us know. And just let them. Mm-hmm. The last thing they want is somebody to insert themselves into their lives.
Right.
But yeah, I think, and so how do you do those things on, you know, I just mentioned like two very traumatic things. How do you do that like in a less traumatic, what might almost seem like a insignificant situation?
Sure.
Like, how do you offer that in, like, I really have to get to I have to make this appointment at 4:30 today, but I have a meeting at 4. Can I leave? Like, am I really necessary? Like,
yeah, I mean, it is something. This is one of the things I saw again and again. Like, it doesn't have to be this devastating thing, but if you have these skills, you can use them in smaller issues, and it actually helps so much. Like, I think of, there was a guy that I worked with. He was a prosecutor, great, really smart guy. And one day he came into my office and he was hot. Like, he was on fire. He's pacing back and forth in front of my desk. And what eventually comes out is he had just left this big meeting. You know, in government, like, you get in these conference rooms and there's like 30 people around this giant, like, skating rink table, right? And he was in this meeting with all these people, and in front of everybody, his boss belittled him, just made him feel so small and minor and insignificant and dumb. And he was so angry about it. And again, you know, he's pacing back and forth in front of my desk, and I'm using all this. I'm just acknowledging, that sounds awful. You know, I'm so sorry. You know, and what do you need right now? And all that stuff. And as I'm doing that, because I'm not arguing with him, I'm not telling him, well, you know, you got to think about it from her perspective. He is not going to hear that, you know?
I mean, she had a point.
Yeah, it's not going to go well.
Insert a small joke.
Yeah. And eventually he kind of winds down and he's okay. And it's like, it's 5 5-minute conversation because I had those skills. I wasn't arguing with him, which would have prolonged it and made him more angry. But because I had that, he was able in 5 minutes to calm down. He goes back to work. I go back to work. He doesn't like go storm into his boss's office and yell at her or do something really dumb, And so I do think that these skills are so helpful on like day-to-day interactions as well as the larger ones. And I also want to underscore one of the points I think you were making, which is it helps one-on-one, but also on an organizational basis. So if you are an organization that's facing a crisis of some kind, remembering that, part of this is giving people an opportunity to speak, to talk about what they're going through, acknowledging that it's hard. You can do this in written communications too, sharing information about like what the plan is and then resources, here's where to go get help. And then don't just drop it, like come back later and return to that point again and again.
Katharine, I have a question for you. So, we're in this age of remote work, and we have some employees who work remote all the time. We have a lot of companies are doing the hybrid method that we are. Of course, we have some employees who have to be here. We have residential campuses, so they don't get that option. But when it comes to remote workers who are working remote all the time, who may kind of lose their sense of community with their workplace because they're not with the people all the time and on the premises. And also understanding that when we ask the question, how are you doing? How do you think it could be helpful in making sure that we are showing an empathetic workplace to people who are working remote all the time, because we don't want to forget about them. So.
Yeah, it's so important. And one of the things I think is important for everybody in a workplace is what I call mastering the art of the quick check-in. Like just make it normal that we check in on each other. So it doesn't seem like such a big deal if your phone rings and you're like, oh my gosh,
Why is somebody calling me?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's the general millennial response to a phone ring.
It can be a message if you want, but just have a normal practice of it so that when something comes up, it doesn't have to be this huge deal, like, oh gosh, now I have to like alert people that I'm going through this crisis. It can come up a little bit more naturally. And I do find it's one of those things that it can be helpful to almost make it a little bit like you kind of have to put it in front of yourself for a little while. If you're not already doing it, like put it in your calendar or give yourself, list everybody on your team and check off when you've talked to them. Like it's going to feel a little bit awkward at first, but I think that's the only way to change your behavior, your practice, to make it feel a little bit normal. And then in terms of how to do it, it's just an easy, like open-ended question, not work related. So not like, hey, how's that project going? But rather like, how did soccer go this weekend? Or like, what movies are you watching lately or something that just shows you care about them beyond the workplace. And when you can build up those relationships over time, it makes it easier to address the harder thing. It is always going to be challenging when people are remote and you're not having that like fortuitous, passing each other in the hall. So you do have to be a little bit more intentional about it, but I still think that it's possible. And it's, I think, worthwhile to think about how it would work on your particular team with your particular people. I mean, yeah, some people will shriek if the phone rings, right? So maybe we don't use the calls for them. Other people love talking on the phone and would be happy to chat, and have a set up time for that. So think about what actually works for the real people involved.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So a question that I have that I would be interested on your perspective on and Tammy's actually as well, when you think about applying this to an organization, we're gonna go like negative a little bit. I could see people that may be skeptical that are in people like Tammy's position, where they're like, people are gonna abuse this. They're gonna use this as a way to get out of whatever, or it's going to be a chronic leave early thing, or what, how do you, from your perspective as the author, but then your perspective as the the leader of an HR department, how do you combat that? Like, do the pros outweigh the cons? Is it worth it? I think, my assumption would be from your perspective is if we have somebody who's going to abuse a policy, it probably means they're not even a right fit for the organization. At least that would be what my perspective is. But yeah, I'm interested. I'm interested on like some of the fear side of it, of like, well, what if it, I mean, I think it's worth it to embrace empathy, but
Yeah, gosh, I have so many thoughts on that question. So, one is I sometimes hear people say they are being empathetic when what they are actually being is conflict avoidant. Empathy for one person has to mean empathy for everybody, and it is not, you are not creating a trauma-informed organization if people don't really know what the rules are, because they change from person to person. Like, you're not creating the sense of safety that is essential to a trauma-informed organization. So to me, part of creating a trauma-informed organization is the 3 C's. So clarity, like we know what the rules are; consistency, they apply evenly, and then within that choice. So we're, as much as possible, we give people autonomy over the decisions that affect their lives. And Tammy just gave a beautiful example. So you have some people who can work telework all the time, and then other people for whom it's not even an option because of the nature of their job. So it's not that everybody has the exact same circumstances, but we have an understanding of why it's different when it is. And I feel like if we approach it from that sense, like we are compassionate with one another, we care about one another, it becomes easier to have the harder conversation more quickly. And where I see often leaders run into problems is they don't really know what to do. They feel a little blindsided when the person comes in and, shares something really difficult, and they sort of go into freeze mode, and then they either blurt out like, well, the rule is this, without really thinking through, what's happened to
is this the right time to get the rule book out?
Yeah, exactly. I had a friend who had this recently where she messaged her boss to say, I have to let you know my mother is dying, and I'm going to have to be up, at her bedside this week. And so it means I might miss the staff meeting. And her boss said, okay, well, just email me ahead with anything you want me to report out.
Oh my.
It's like, do we miss something here?
You can just copy and paste the message.
Exactly. Yeah. Or they go kind of too far the other way, and then they end up in a situation like I heard one leader say that somebody came to him and told him that she had cancer, and he felt so terrible, and he said, whatever you need, and we're going to put all these things in place for you, but no sense of like how long that was going to last, or
in perpetuity.
Yeah, exactly. And so finally, after, she's been through the treatments and appears to be fine, and she's still, getting all of these supports, and he broaches with her, maybe we can start to peel those back. And she's furious because you said that I could have this as long as I needed, and he's kind of in this stuck position. So you want to make sure that you're being thoughtful from the beginning. But I really feel like having a bit of a framework to help can avoid some of that deer in the headlights, like I'm just going to blurt out something.
Yeah, and I think the laser method and those 3 C's does help. Because I think the accountability aspect of trauma-informed care for the workforce is probably one of the things that, leaders are concerned about, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this empathetic leadership training, because I feel like we need to help them understand how to go about doing this, not only as a coworker, but also as a leader in the organization. So, and I mean, sure, you're going to have a person here and there that's going to take advantage, and that will become clear. But I don't think that most people are like that and want to do that. And so I think when we can be empathetic and truly caring and supportive, to me, I think that's going to go much further than us, being always questioning what they're doing, which I think HR sometimes gets a bad rap for that, because we're always like,
spying on.
Yes, right? Like if HR is involved,
watch out
that
for
cannot
Tammy.
be good. And so I've been working to try to change that. I mean, certainly, yes, that's part of what, but it's such a small part. I think it's so much more about it's human resources. It's the humans that are resources in our organization. And, we have to care about them. That's what we have to be doing. So, anyway.
Yeah, people aren't machines.
No.
I think too, it's been interesting, I've run my own businesses for a few years now, and just like working on like figuring out like what does growth look like. And I have zero desire to be in charge of people, but I'm sure it's part of what running a business is. But the more and more I read about like leaders and the things that you like apply to be a good leader, what I feel like you have to, all of the books, yours included, what it makes you do is like you have to relinquish control. Like the more you hold on to like controlling every situation, the bigger problems you end up having. You get into that more authoritarian state where it's like, well, this is how it's going to be, and I'm in charge, and it feels like there's so much more importance being put on building good frameworks with lots of accountability and freedom inside of the framework, and kind of just like letting that do its thing.
It's so true. I think you can lead by fear and actually get quite a lot done pretty quickly.
But it's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable. I mean,
for either party.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think about U.S. Women's Olympics gymnastics. So one of the cases I worked on at DOJ was the Larry Nassar case. And so the Karolis were the head of the coaches of the team, and they were phenomenal coaches, and they won a lot of gold medals. But they also created this culture of fear on the team where, if you had a broken ankle, if you were starving, if you, something horrible happened in your life, it was like, well, there's a line of girls a mile long waiting to take your place.
There's the door.
Yep, exactly. And so what it did is created this culture where somebody like Larry Nassar is able to thrive because all these girls are so afraid to speak up because they feel like nobody's going to believe them. They don't care what they're saying. And look what happens. We end up with, 200 people being abused. He's in jail. The U.S. Women's Olympics gymnastic bankrupt. Karoli farm is shut down. I mean, so yeah, they won a lot of gold medals, but think about if you just kind of put the horizon a little bit further. I mean, I can't see anybody saying that was a success. But if instead you are willing to lead in a way where you are taking, input from other people and believing that other people have really good ideas. I mean, the four of us here are way smarter than any single one of us. And so think about what we can accomplish when people feel empowered to be authentic and share their ideas, even if they're not entirely sure, that they're right about it. I mean, what you can do is so much better and so much more sustainable over the long term.
It sounds like what you're describing is psychological safety, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Can you define that for us?
Sure. Psychological safety is largely known through the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson, who's at Harvard. And it's the idea that within this team, it is safe to admit that I made a mistake, or that I don't know the answer, or that I'm having a hard time right now. I first came across it when I read about this study that Google did. So Google wanted to know what made for a successful team. And, it's Google, so they have all the information, right? So they're able to look at...
And all the money.
Yeah, exactly. They can look at lots and lots of teams.
I want to know this.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So they looked at all these different configurations of teams, like teams where everybody had a different background or everybody had similar background, or teams where there was one strong leader or no strong leaders or a lot of strong leaders, teams where they were all men and all women. They looked at teams where people socialized after work and where they didn't. And nothing seemed to explain why some of the teams were so much more successful until they hit upon this idea of psychological safety. And once they found that concept, it explained everything. It was like productivity, creativity, inclusion and belonging, ethical behavior, everything they looked at, to the point where the woman who was heading up this study at Google said it wasn't even worth looking at anything else because psychological safety explained it all. And one of the things they found is that the fastest way to build psychological safety on a team is to support each other in hard times. Which probably makes sense, like just from your own life. When you think about a hard time and who was there for you, those are your people forever. And it works on an individual basis and it works on an organizational basis.
What an incredible way to wrap up.
I know. That really resonates. I do have to end on a lighthearted note because I promised all my colleagues that we would ask you about Thanksgiving, which is coming up.
Yes.
Okay.
And
It's right after an election, which is the easiest time to get together with
Yes,
family
for
members.
sure. For sure.
Exactly. What advice do you have? How can we use your methods of empathy and the laser method to talk to our family members this Thanksgiving?
All right, so I am not going to give you any advice on confronting people about issues. I am just going to give you advice on getting through dinner. Okay?
No, we want to start fights, Katharine.
Yeah, no.
I got to know how to win.
No.
Let's just
not what
survive
we're
this. And it
talking about.
might be, maybe you want to have a conversation, probably not at dinner. Like there might be something, but just let's get through dinner. Okay, I have two tricks for this. Okay, you ready? So the first one is shift your perspective. So what I do, if I know I am about to have a really difficult interaction with somebody who kind of pushes my buttons, I go in with a goal of coming out of it with 3 really funny, well-honed stories about how ridiculous that was. And so what happens is when the person says something that really riles me, I'm like, ooh, there's one. And I get excited, like, what's going to be next, you know? And I start thinking through, how can I tell this in a really funny way later, you know?
And
then
you calculate the next button to click to get the next thing.
true. And then the other thing I do, and it's a little hard over the over audio, but when somebody says something that is really, really difficult, you know, like offensive in some way, I just get very quiet. Like picture a cartoon, head to the side and like a question mark above. Okay. So, and then I let the silence go a little longer than is natural. So I'm just looking at the person quizzically. And usually what happens is they start to get a little bit uncomfortable and then they think through, what did I just say? And then they start to get a little defensive about what they said and they start to defend themselves. Well, I'm just saying this because, but you haven't said anything. So they're just arguing with themselves. And then eventually they peter out and you can change the subject. It's great.
Yeah, that's genius.
That is.
Just don't follow it up with, that was really fun to watch.
Don't pull out your phone and start recording. This will be great on TikTok later.
Yeah, because then you can title it with X person gets owned by X person with no words. And you get 7 million views and a record deal or something.
Wow, something.
But I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving. It's my favorite holiday. And honestly, for me, it's always about the stuffing. The stuffing is the best.
It is. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
We're so grateful you're here today.
Oh, thank you.
Can you tell everybody who's listening just about where they can follow along with what you're doing, if you're, any other books or works that you're doing, and how they could maybe get in touch with you for a session for consulting at their organization or any of the workshops that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So my website is katharinemanning.com, and that's Katharine, Katharine. I also am just launching, you guys are some of the first to hear about it, a easy guide to the laser technique. It's called, if you go to lasertechnique.info, there's like a downloadable there. So if you are somebody who is maybe not going to read a whole book and you would like to know a little bit more about the laser technique, that's an easy place to go to learn more
The
about
audiobook
it.
is easy, everybody. Just
She's a great
narrator.
reader. Yeah, I really like her. Yeah, exactly. So all of those, and I'm happy to share my email. Would that be helpful?
We can put it in the show notes.
Okay, yeah. So anybody, please reach out anytime. I love talking about these issues.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.